Alright, welcome to our Chapter 12 review video. This is going to be really quick. So regarding the ocean, 71% of the Earth's surface is covered in water. The largest ocean is the Pacific, and then the smallest ocean is the Arctic. We talked about weather, ocean temperatures, how the Earth is on an axis of 23 degrees, and the center of the Earth is called the equator. Across the center of the Earth is the equator, and the equator gets the most sunlight. It gets the most direct sunlight. The sun comes at towards the poles, but not as much. They don't get as much direct sunlight. So as the Earth rotates on this axis of 23 degrees, the equator is getting the most direct sunlight, so water is the warmest at the equator. Water is also going to be warmest in the ocean when the sun is out the longest. So the equator is the place, and then the summer is the time when it's going to be warmest. That means in the winter, even at the equator, it's going to be cooler than during the summer. During the winter, the poles at the North and South Pole would be the coldest places, the North and South Pole in the winter. Warmest, the equator in the summer. Alright, the ocean floor is made up of two big sections. All you really need to know for the test, now that we've done our in-class modeling, is that there's two big sections. You have the continental margin and then the deep ocean basin. Whoops. Okay, so deep ocean basin is comprised of the abyssal plain, seamounts, those little volcanic mountains, the mid-ocean ridge, where the tectonic plates are pulling apart from each other, and new ocean floors being created during seafloor spreading. You have guyots that were seamounts that became volcanic islands, and then eventually erosion and water level rising caused them these flat top islands to now be underwater. You have ocean trenches, is where subduction is happening. You have two plates subducting down. Or you have a deep ocean trench is going to be where the continental margin and the continental crust and the oceanic crust meet, and you have a subduction zone. That'll form a deep ocean trench as well. But so your two big things for the test is to know the continental margin and the deep ocean basin. One more thing regarding the ocean water. Let's go back over and look at this. Ocean water is made up of a lot of different minerals, as well as just water, H2O. But the most abundant dissolved solid in the ocean is called sodium chloride, which is what it makes up our table salt. So sodium chloride is the name of salt, like the salt that you eat, that makes up the most of dissolved solid in the ocean. We talk about salinity of ocean water. Salinity doesn't just refer to salt, though. Salinity also refers to it's just a measure of the amount of a dissolved solid in ocean water. So if you took sugar and you put it in water, you could measure the salinity of the water, that dissolved solid, how much sugar is in the water. So salinity doesn't refer just to salt, but the most abundant dissolved solid in the ocean is sodium chloride. So the greatest salinity is sodium chloride. Recall also that we talked about how in the Red Sea, we have the Red Sea is one of the highest places, and the Dead Sea too. Dead Sea and Red Sea have the highest salinity levels, because they're hot there, right? And so the greater the temperature, the more the water is going to evaporate. That leaves behind a lot of salt. Over at the mouth of the Amazon, you have fresh water coming and joining the ocean water. So the mouth of the Amazon, that area over here, has less salinity. So this area over here has less salinity than the Red Sea or other areas that are really hot. So different places have different concentrations of dissolved solids. All right. Regarding ocean resources, there are two different types of ocean resources. We have living resources is our first type. These are resources are things you get from the ocean that we use. Some of them we use in our everyday lives. For example, seaweed. We talked about how seaweed is used as a thickener. For example, in ice cream. Ice cream has seaweed in it quite often. We also get fish and crabs and shrimp and oysters from the ocean. We fish or farm. We go fishing in the ocean, and we also do fish farming. We discussed kind of the pros and cons of fish farming. Had some fun conversation about that in class. But so fish farms are these on land, near the shore, areas where people harvest or grow and harvest fish, rather than taking them out of the ocean, because people are afraid of us taking too many fish out of the ocean and then disrupting ocean habitats. Okay, so there, seaweed as a thickener in ice cream, and then fish are your two living resources that we discussed. Non-living resources. There were a few there. Non-living. So the most valued ocean resource is crude oil. Right, that's the one that people pay a lot of money for. It goes into making petroleum products, into making plastics. We use it, gasoline for our cars. Crude oil is really, really valued, and it's used all around the world. So we do offshore drilling to get crude oil from the ocean. That means we're drilling into the ocean floor to get this. We talked about nodules and getting minerals from the ocean. That means not just salt, but other minerals like manganese, a lot of other resources too, but the main one that we discussed was that we get salt, which is a mineral, from the ocean. To get salt from the ocean, we said that you do desalination plants. That means that we heat up the water and then we separate the water. It evaporates and you separate the water and the salt. So you're able to get fresh water and salt from desalination, but it's really expensive and it's not super practical. A That's why we don't rely on the ocean as a source of water, because it's really expensive. You have to pay for the energy to heat the water. But know that salt is a resource we get from the ocean. We also talked about how you could get tidal energy. So tidal energy is where during high tide, water comes in. You close this gate, so now water is trapped back here behind this gate. Now the tide goes out, so now the water up here is higher than where the tide is, and you open up the gate, and the water comes out and it spins this turbine, which generates electricity. And it's a renewable energy source. We said it's relatively inexpensive to build and operate, and it's sustainable, but it's impractical for a lot of places just because you need this you need a narrow channel with shallow waters in order to operate a tidal energy plant like this. Okay, then we talked about pollution, that there's two different types of pollution. The first is non-point source pollution. Now, non-point source pollution comes from a lot of different places. It's really hard to target or pinpoint one specific place for non-point source pollution. It comes from like city streets. You have trash. You have motor oil coming in. People put pesticides on their crops, and that runs off into water. Oil and trash run down drains when, like if they're in the street. If your car's leaking oil and oil gets on the street when it rains, trash and oil end up going down the gutters, and the gutters eventually go into streams or man-made channels, and eventually that leads into water sources. They lead into the ocean, and they get deposited on beaches, and then that gets carried into the ocean, or gets deposited directly into ocean water. So all these different sources are runoff is carrying these different hazardous materials into the water. The water's coming down and joining the ocean. That would be non-point source pollution. When we look at like the trash in the ocean, a lot of it, and a lot of oil in the ocean, most of the ocean's oil that's in it comes from this non-point source pollution from a lot of different places, a lot of different sources. This is different than point source pollution, our second type. Point source pollution comes from specific places, from a specific site. For example, an oil spill, right? If a boat crashes with another boat and it spills a bunch of oil, you know right where this big puddle of oil here came from, right? There's no question of, well, where did this oil come from? What was its source? No, we know its source is the boats that crashed, or its source is the pipe that burst. Or here, so you have oil spills. You have trash dumping. Where people or companies or businesses would take a bunch of trash and just dump it in the ocean as a way to get rid of it. There was sludge dumping. Sludge dumping, we said, was extremely toxic. And you're taking human sewage, and the liquid is being pressed out of it, and you have this solid waste left over, and then they're dumping that in the ocean. And obviously that's toxic, and it harms wildlife. Same with trash dumping and oil spills. We talked about how oil spills coat coat birds feathers and then they can't fly. Fish can't breathe in it; they die. With plastics, that fish can eat the plastic because it breaks down, and they think that it's plankton, and it ends up in their stomachs. And if it doesn't kill them, well, it can end up on your plate later. Or the animals can end up trapped in the plastics, and they can grow up around it, or it could strangle them. They can't swim necessarily. That could get them caught. So it's just a really sad thing. So it's really important to be aware of these point source pollutions, but know that these are easier to regulate. So a lot of laws have been made against it. For example, 1972 Clean Water Act that we learned about in the last chapter, that wanted to make all U.S. waters safe for swimming and fishing. This act also said the Environmental Protection Agency is now going to issue permits to dump trash and dump sludge. So this agency tells people whether or not they're allowed to go put trash in the ocean. Then there's also the U.S. Marine Sanctuaries Act. Marine Sanctuaries and Research Act. This law was regarding, again, ocean dumping, what could be put in the ocean, who has permission to go dump things in the ocean. These laws are ways that the government is regulating and working to keep our oceans clean. But we talked about that our job, as individuals, was a really big one in keeping our streets clean, in limiting the amount of fertilizers and pesticides that we use, and cleaning up after our animals, because all of our pollution ends up in our city, ends up in the ocean at some point. So we have a job, because it's really hard for the government to regulate it. We have a job of personally taking responsibility for our pollution and cleaning up after ourselves so that this waste doesn't end up in the ocean. All right, so you should be ready now for Friday's test. Good luck. If you have any questions, don't be afraid to email Miss Wall or post a comment on Schoology and ask your classmates. But I'm confident that you guys are all going to do great.